Where does the word Britain actually come from? The name first appears in the ancient sources in the late 4th century BC, not originally as the name of a country, but in reference to a people, the Britons. And that's what this video is about today, where the name comes from, who it originally referred to, and what the linguistic, historical and genetic evidence actually tells us about the Britons, the people who ultimately gave their name to Britain. The earliest attestations of the Britons don't coincide with any identifiable migration event. They mark the point at which long-established populations first appear in the historical record under an externally applied name. The name appears in Greek sources both as the name of a people and by extension as the name of the islands they inhabited, and we'll come back to what the name itself means in a moment. In these sources, Britain is described as Britannicae, Britannica, or Britannicae Nesoi, the Britannic Islands, and in Greek ethnographic usage, it is the name of the people that gives rise to the geographic term and not the reverse. By the time classical authors describe Britain and its inhabitants, the people in question are already settled and already rooted in the landscape, and that's where we need to start if we're going to understand who the Britons actually were. If we want to understand how this name entered the Greek world, we have to begin with Pytheas of Massalia, writing in the late 4th century BC. Pytheas is the earliest known Greek author to have described Britain directly based on personal experience travelling along the Atlantic facade. His original work, Peri tou Okeanou, or On the Ocean, does not survive, but what we have instead are fragments, paraphrases and summaries preserved by later writers, most notably Strabo, Diodorus Siculus and Pliny the Elder. It is through these authors that Pytheas' account reaches us, and it is through them that the name of the Britons enters Greek literature. In these later sources, Pytheas is consistently associated with the description of the Britannicae Nesoi, the Britannic Islands, and with the peoples who inhabited them. Although his work was later criticised by some ancient writers, particularly Strabo, those criticisms are directed at Pytheas' astronomical claims and measurements, and not at the existence of Britain itself, nor at the peoples he described. By the 1st century BC, Britain is no longer an abstraction. It is a known place inhabited by known peoples already embedded within wider Atlantic networks of trade and exchange. And it is from this Pythian tradition that our earliest substantive descriptions of the Britons ultimately derive. Pytheas' voyage did not take place in isolation. By the late 4th century BC, the Atlantic facade of Europe was already part of a well-established network of maritime exchange, linking the western coasts of Britain, Gaul and Iberia to Mediterranean trade systems that ultimately extended into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Central to that network was tin. British tin was a strategic resource in the ancient world, essential for the production of bronze, and its movement along Atlantic and overland routes is already implicit in the earliest Greek accounts of the region. Long before Pytheas wrote, tin extracted from southwest Britain was moved through these routes, feeding into continental and Mediterranean economies. Isotopic analysis has since shown that British tin reached as far east as the Levant, with material consistent with Cornish sources identified in contexts as distant as Haifa. That evidence primarily belongs to the Bronze Age, and I'll be returning to it properly in a separate video. But it matters here because it confirms what we've already implied, that by the time of Pytheas, Britain was not being drawn into a long-distance exchange for the first time. It was already embedded within an existing, mature trade network. Pytheas came from Massalia, one of the principal trading ports of the Western Mediterranean. His voyage north did not begin from the edge of the Greek world, but from one of its most outward-facing commercial centres, a city already oriented towards long-distance exchange. Pytheas' description of Britain therefore belongs within this context, not as the discovery of a remote island, but as the reporting of an exchange already known, at least indirectly, through trade and exchange. The tin trade itself really deserves a fuller treatment, and I'll be returning to it in a future video, so keep an eye out. But for now, what matters is that Britain enters Greek writing as part of a connected Atlantic world, a place already described in relation to trade routes, resources and movement. The most detailed surviving description of the Britons comes from Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC. Diodorus is explicit that his account draws on earlier Greek sources, ultimately deriving from the Pythian tradition. Before quoting him directly, it's worth noting how he frames the people of Britain. He describes them as autochthonous, a term used in Greek ethnography to denote peoples understood as native to their land, not recent arrivals. The word itself is quite revealing. Autochthonous is made up of the word autos, meaning self, and chthon, which means earth, giving a literal meaning of sprung from the land itself. He also emphasises continuity of custom, the preservation of what he calls an ancient way of life. Among the practices he highlights is warfare conducted from harmasi, or chariots, explicitly compared to the heroic warfare of the Trojan War. In Diodorus' words, quote, "It is said that an autochthonous people inhabit Britannicae, preserving an ancient way of life in their customs. They wage war in chariots, just as the heroes of old are said to have done in the Trojan War. Their dwellings are simple, built mostly from reeds or timber. They harvest wheat by hand, cutting the ears themselves and sorting them in covered granaries. From these they draw out the grain each day, prepare it, and make their food." End quote. What Diodorus presents here is not a scattered or transient population, but a coherent society, agriculturally organised, militarily structured, and culturally continuous. A similar picture appears in the writings of Julius Caesar. Writing in the mid-1st century BC, Caesar describes Britain and its inhabitants not as an unknown or primitive society, but as a place with established modes of warfare, political organisation, and social structure. In particular, he gives a detailed account of British chariot warfare, and it's worth hearing him directly here because he describes the system with unusual clarity. Quote, "This is the manner of fighting from chariots. First, they drive around in all directions and hurl their missiles and generally disorder the ranks of the enemy by the terror of their horses and the noises of their wheels. Then, when they have worked their way between the squadrons of cavalry, they leap down from their chariots and fight on foot. The charioteers, meanwhile, withdraw a short distance from the battle and so place themselves with the chariots that if their comrades are overpowered by the number of their enemy, they may have a ready means of retreat. Thus, they show in battle the mobility of cavalry and the steadiness of infantry." End quote. Although Caesar's emphasis differs from that of Diodorus, reflecting Roman military concerns, the underlying impression is consistent. The Britons are presented as a coherent population, occupying defined territories, practicing distinctive customs, and understood by outsiders as a distinct people. Taken together with the Greek tradition, Caesar's account reinforces the view that Britain was not encountered as a land of scattered or transient groups, but as a region inhabited by organised societies that were already long established. As previously mentioned, in the Greek sources, the people of Britain are referred to as the autochthonous inhabitants of Britannicae. The word Britannicae in form is pre-Roman and non-Latin, and reflects a name heard by Greek speakers that was then rendered into Greek. The ethnonym for the people themselves is generally reconstructed as Pretani or Pritani, and has traditionally been interpreted as relating to body decoration or tattooing. As Barry Cunliffe notes, Pretani is a Celtic word that probably means the painted ones or the tattoo folk, referring to body decoration. A reminder of Caesar's observations of woad-painted barbarians. Now, this interpretation is reinforced by later Roman terminology, which was applied to populations beyond direct Roman control. From the late Roman period onward, authors used the name Picti for groups living north of the Roman frontier, not as a self-designation, but as a Latin descriptive label. The Latin term Picti derives from pictus, the perfect passive participle of pingo, to paint, used adjectively and substantively to mean the painted or the decorated. In classical Latin, however, pictus denotes not only tattooing, but painting, colouring, ornamentation, and decorative patterning. And ultimately, the same linguistic root survives today in our modern English word, picture. Crucially, this Roman label does not imply a separate ethnic or linguistic origin. As John T. Cock makes clear, the populations later labelled Picti are best understood, prior to the 5th century, as part of the wider Brittonic continuum. The evidence for this lies in personal names, place names, and inscriptional material which consistently align Pictish with P-Celtic sound patterns rather than Goidelic ones. On linguistic grounds, Pictish is therefore best interpreted as a Brittonic language closely related to early Welsh. From at least the 5th century, however, this situation begins to change. Cock notes that the Picts came under increasing political and linguistic pressure from the Gaels of Dalriata, leading over time to a process of Gaelicisation in parts of Pictland. Returning now to Pretani, the idea of painting or tattooing does not exhaust the meaning of the name itself. As John Cock has shown, the ethnonym derives from a deeper Celtic root meaning form or shape, which has been reconstructed in Proto-Celtic as the root crit. This root is preserved in Old Irish cruth and Welsh prid, both meaning form. In the Goidelic branch, cruth gives rise to ethnonyms such as Cruthin or Crinna, names used in Irish sources for the Picts. In the Brittonic branch, the same root survives in Welsh prid, and ultimately in Prydain, the Welsh name for Britain itself. The root also appears in Welsh prydydd, literally maker of forms, the title of the highest grade of poet in the medieval bardic order. Cock concludes, quote, Brittany, Britons, or the people of the forms, could originally have referred to people sharing particular linguistic forms and verbal traditions in addition to, or as opposed to, material culture, end quote. Seen in this light then, tattooing becomes one possible expression of a broader principle. The name Pretani does not simply describe how the Britons marked their bodies, but how they were recognised as a people, through shared forms of appearance, expression, and cultural identity. Questions of tattooing belong to a wider discussion, and I'm going to cover that in a separate video. As Britain enters the Roman world, the name by which it was known begins to shift in form. The Greek Britannicae begins to appear in Latin sources as Britannia. This change reflects the adaptation of a foreign ethnonym into Latin phonology. As John Cock notes, Latin frequently altered unfamiliar consonant clusters when borrowing names from Celtic and other languages, particularly at the beginning of words. A well-attested parallel is found in the Latin word gladius. Cock observes that gladius is a borrowing from Old Celtic gladios, meaning sword, which is preserved in Welsh cleddyf, in which the original voiceless stop was perceived and rendered as its voiced equivalent under Latin phonological conditions. Cock further explains that the presence of liquids such as R or L can cause a preceding voiceless consonant to be heard as voiced in Latin transmission. On this model, the development of Britannia from an original Britannica follows the same phonological logic. This same process can be seen in Roman place names. Koch notes that the battle site recorded by Tacitus as Mons Graupius probably reflects an underlying Celtic name, Craupios, with an original voiceless consonant again rendered as voiced in Latin usage. Whether this represents a straightforward Latin rendering or a borrowing back into British from Latin usage, the result is the same. Britones replaces Brittany as the name of the people in Latin sources, while the older form survives primarily as the name of the island, Welsh Prydain. Crucially, this is a change of name form and not of a population, a point that will become clearer when we turn to the genetic evidence. Roman authors themselves treat Brittany as the Latin name for the same people, earlier known to Greek writers as Prytany. Over time, Roman usage becomes more precise. By the early imperial period, authors distinguish between Brittany south of the Fourth Clyde Line, Picty to the north, and later the Scotti arriving from Ireland. But these distinctions represent administrative and ethnographic categorisation, not the sudden appearance of new peoples. The underlying population and the deeper linguistic roots of the name remains continuous. What changes is not who the people are, but how different cultures choose to spell and pronounce their name. Although Roman usage fixed the Latin form Brittany and Britannia, the older Celtic form of the name did not disappear. It survived intact in the languages of Britain itself. In Welsh, the name for Britain is Prydain. The Welsh retain the initial P sound found in Prytany because Welsh belongs to the P-Celtic branch of the Celtic languages, in which the Proto-Celtic qu regularly developed into P. This preserves the native phonology of the name rather than the Latinised form. A similar phenomenon can be seen in the Greek and Latin words for horse, where different Indo-European reflexes are preserved in each language. Latin equus and Greek hippos, two inherited Indo-European forms referring to the same animal but shaped by different phonological histories. Latin, by contrast, had no obligation to preserve indigenous sound patterns. So when Roman authors adopted the name, it was reshaped according to Latin phonological expectations, producing Brittany rather than Prytany. The survival of Prydain in Welsh therefore matters because it demonstrates continuity of naming within Britain itself, independent of Roman usage. That continuity is not limited to Wales. In the north of Britain, a closely related Brittonic language, usually referred to as Cumbric, was spoken across what is now northern England and southern Scotland well into the early medieval period. The very name Cumbria preserves this legacy. It derives from Combrogi, which means fellow countryman, the same Brittonic root that survives in the Welsh name for Wales, Cymru. And this tells us something crucial. Brittonic speech was not confined to what is now Wales. It once extended across much of northern Britain, persisting long after the end of Roman rule. Traces of this survival appear not only in place names, but also in cultural practices. One striking example is the traditional sheep counting systems recorded in northern England. Numerical sequences closely related to Welsh counting forms, preserved among shepherd communities into the modern period. Taken together, these survivals show that the older P form of the name Prytany was not replaced within Britain itself. It continued in living speech, even as Roman and later Latin-derived languages imposed the B form in writing and administration. And this matters for what comes next, because when we turn to genetics, we're not asking whether the Britons were replaced by new populations bearing a different name. We are asking whether the biological evidence reflects the same long-term regional continuity already visible in language, naming and cultural survival. And that is where the genetic evidence becomes meaningful, not as an origin story, but as a test of continuity. Taken together then, the Pythian tradition and Diodorus' account reinforce a crucial point. The appearance of the Britons in the historical record does not mark their arrival in Britain, it marks their recognition. By the time Greek and Roman authors begin to describe them, the Britons are already a long-established population, occupying defined territories, practicing distinctive customs, and understood by outsiders as a distinct group. That is why the origins of the Britons are not to be found in a single migration, invasion, or founding event. They lie in the point at which a long-formed population, shaped by linguistic, cultural, and biological continuity, becomes visible in the historic record under a shared name, and it is those deeper layers behind the name itself that we now need to examine. When we turn to genetics, we're not looking for a single origin moment. What ancient DNA allows us to do instead is identify layers of ancestry that accumulated in Britain over long periods of time, and then test whether later Iron Age and Roman populations show continuity with that prehistoric background. In one of the most influential genome-wide studies of later prehistoric Europe, Olalde and colleagues analysed ancient DNA from hundreds of individuals spanning the Neolithic and Bronze Age, including multiple individuals from Britain sampled across several centuries. In the British case, these genetic signals consistently resolve into three deep ancestral sources, and these are Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG, ancestry associated with early farming populations ultimately derived from Anatolia and the Near East, and these are usually called early European farmers, or EEFs. And finally, steppe-related ancestry introduced during the later Neolithic and early Bronze Age. And what matters here is not the labels, but what they represent. Each component reflects a long-established population lineage formed over many generations rather than a single historical event or a named cultural group. These ancestry components describe the biological background of prehistoric populations living in Britain through time, not the movement of a single Beaker people, but the cumulative ancestry carried by individuals buried in Britain from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. And by modelling how these components appear, mix and stabilise through time, ancient DNA allows us to test whether later populations are biologically continuous with earlier ones, or whether a genuine population replacement has occurred. This gives us a way to test continuity rather than assume it. The earliest of these layers belong to the Western hunter-gatherers, or WHGs. These were the first modern humans to inhabit Britain after the end of the last ice age, arriving shortly after the glaciers retreated around 11,700 years ago. They entered Britain across the land bridge that once connected southern Britain to continental Europe, establishing small mobile populations who lived as hunter-gatherers, exploiting woodland, coastal and riverine environments. One of the most famous representatives of this population is Cheddaman, a Mesolithic individual dated to around 10,000 years ago, whose genome places him firmly within the Western hunter-gatherer cluster identified across Western and Northern Europe. Genetically, WHGs form a distinctive ancestral group characterised by shared ancestry stretching from Iberia through to Scandinavia. They represent the deepest biological layer in Britain's post-glacial population history. Around 6,000 years ago, a major shift occurs. Populations associated with the spread of Neolithic farming begin to move into Britain from continental Europe, bringing with them agriculture, domesticated plants and animals, pottery, timber-built dwellings, and new forms of landscape organisation, including long barrows and causewayed enclosures. In genetic literature, these populations are grouped under the shorthand Early European Farmers, or EEFs. Their deeper ancestry ultimately traces back to farming populations originating in Anatolia and the Near East, who had already spread through the Balkans and along Atlantic Europe before reaching Britain. Ancient DNA shows that this was not merely the adoption of farming by local hunter-gatherers, but a substantial population movement. Earlier Mesolithic groups contributed only a limited ancestry to the Neolithic population that followed. In the Beaker study, British Neolithic individuals cluster firmly with the continental Neolithic farmer populations prior to the introduction of steppe-related ancestry. The third major ancestral component enters the picture around 4,400 years ago, during the early Bronze Age. This phase is associated archaeologically with the spread of Bell Beaker material culture across much of Western and Central Europe. Genetically, individuals buried with Beaker-associated material in Britain carry substantial steppe-related ancestry, reflecting population movements that had already reshaped much of Europe during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. These populations are associated with new metallurgical traditions, particularly copper and early bronze working, and with broader social and technological changes visible across Northern Europe. In Britain, the demographic impact was substantial. Within a few centuries of the arrival of Beaker-associated populations, genetic models indicate that around 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool had been replaced, with only a small fraction of earlier farmer ancestry persisting. This does not imply that Britain was emptied and repopulated, but it does indicate a major demographic turnover at the start of the Bronze Age. It's also worth briefly noting a more recent high-resolution genetic study published in 2022, led by Nick Patterson and colleagues. Using genome-wide data from nearly 800 individuals, the study identified additional population movement into southern Britain during the Middle to Late Bronze Age, particularly affecting what is now southern England and Wales. Crucially though, this was not the arrival of a wholly new ancestral population. The individuals involved carried the same deep genetic substrates already present in Britain. Ancestry ultimately derived from Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers, and steppe-related populations, but in slightly different proportions. Genetically, these incoming groups were more similar to contemporary populations in northern France, pointing to regional admixture within an already connected Atlantic world rather than large-scale population replacement. The authors suggest that this later movement may have provided a plausible demographic vector for the spread of early Celtic languages and cultural practices into southern Britain. Importantly, this does not imply the introduction of a distinct Celtic people in biological terms. As both archaeology and linguistics increasingly emphasise, Celtic is best understood as a family of languages and associated cultural traditions, not a genetically bounded ethnic group. Like Romanisation in the historical period, Celtic language and culture could spread through contact, interaction, and limited migration without disrupting the underlying genetic coherence of the population. What matters for our purposes is actually what happens after the Beaker period. By the time Greek and Roman authors begin to describe the Britons, the population of Britain is already long formed in genetic terms, carrying ancestry shaped by the three aforementioned successive prehistoric layers. The question then becomes whether Iron Age and Roman period genomes show continuity with that background. One of the clearest demonstrations of this comes from the study of genomes from Britain across Iron Age and Roman contexts, set against later early medieval migrations. In practical terms, this comparison involves three groups: a pre-Roman Iron Age group, a group of people buried during the Roman period in Britain, and finally, a group of individuals from the later Anglo-Saxon period. Martiniano and colleagues compared genomes from Iron Age Britain with Roman period burials and showed that the Roman individuals cluster closely with the Iron Age samples while remaining clearly distinct from later Anglo-Saxon individuals. In the York Driffield Terrace Roman cemetery specifically, they infer most individuals to be of British origin, alongside one individual with origins in the Middle East, which serves as a reminder that Roman Britain could be cosmopolitan without erasing local continuity. Schiffels and colleagues likewise interpret Anglo-Saxon period ancestry as an additional layer to the previous three we have discussed, and not as a wholesale replacement of the earlier population. So the genetic evidence supports a clear sequence. First, a deep prehistoric layering of Western hunter-gatherer, early European farmer and Beaker-related ancestry, followed by a period of stabilisation after the early Bronze Age, which then continues through to the Iron Age and into Roman Britain, where after that there are later admixture events rather than a wholesale replacement. And this returns us to the central point. The Britons were not a genetically pure people, but neither is any modern population living today. They were identifiable because they shared a broadly similar mixture of ancestral components reinforced by shared language, culture, territory and descent. What genetics adds here is not an origin myth, but a test of continuity. This shows that the Roman conquest did not introduce a new population that replaced the existing inhabitants. Instead, later Anglo-Saxon expansion represents the addition of a further genetic layer on top of an already established ancestral background, much as the Beaker-associated populations had done millennia earlier, rather than a wholesale replacement of the Iron Age population. And on the evidence we have, from the prehistoric time transects through Iron Age and Roman genomes, the Britons enter the historical record as a people already long established, not as the product of a new migration in the centuries immediately before their name appears. Taken together, the evidence points to genetic coherence rather than genetic purity. Populations tend to resemble one another biologically because they share ancestry accumulated across generations, alongside a shared language, culture and territory. And this pattern is not unique to Britain. It is how human populations have always formed. Up to this point, everything we've looked at has been population-level evidence, ancient genomes, archaeological contexts, and long-term continuity across thousands of years. What I want to do now is briefly scale that down, not to make a personal claim, but to give a concrete example of how this kind of evidence is interpreted today. And to do that, I'm going to use my own DNA results. Not because it's special, and not because it proves anything on its own, but because it lets us see how modern genetic tools relate individual people to the population patterns we've just been discussing. Now, it's important to be clear from the start that not all DNA tests do the same thing. And I'm using two different services because they answer two different questions. The first is ancestry. Ancestry works by comparing your DNA to very large reference panels made up of living populations whose families have been in the same regions for many generations. Based on statistical similarity, it estimates which modern population your DNA most closely resembles. So when Ancestry says something like X% from this region, it's not telling you where your ancestors came from in a historical sense. It's actually telling you which modern populations your DNA most closely matches today, based on patterns observed across millions of samples. And this makes it useful for understanding recent population background, broadly speaking, in the last few hundred years. Now, what it does not do is identify ancient peoples, Iron Age tribes, or archaeological cultures, so Ancestry gives us a modern reference point, not an ancient one. The second tool I'm using today is My True Ancestry, which works in a very different way. Rather than comparing you to modern populations, it compares segments of your DNA to published ancient genomes, individuals recovered from archaeological contexts and sequenced in academic studies. And I mean, these include samples from the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age and early historic periods. What My True Ancestry does not claim is descent from a specific named individual, tribe or culture. Instead, it looks at genetic similarity, which ancient samples your DNA most closely resembles within the limits of available data. And this makes it a useful tool not as proof of identity, but as a way of visualising how modern individuals fit within long-term population continuity. Now, used together, these two approaches let us see the same person from two different angles. Ancestry shows how my DNA relates to modern populations, and my true ancestry shows how that same DNA clusters in relation to ancient samples drawn from archaeological contexts. Neither of these replaces population-level research, neither proves ancestry in a historical or cultural sense, but together they help illustrate the key point of this video, that modern people in Britain tend to sit within long-established regional genetic patterns rather than standing apart from them. So before we look at the results, it's worth setting expectations. What we're about to see, it's not dramatic, there's no single origin point, no sudden break, and no hidden migration waiting to be revealed. And that, in itself, is exactly the point. What these tools tend to show, when interpreted carefully, is continuity. The same kind of continuity we've already seen in the ancient DNA, the archaeology, the language, and the historical record. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the results, first from Ancestry and then from My True Ancestry.
Okay, so here are my ancestral regions according to Ancestry UK. And you can see the highest percentage here is northeast of England, 55%, followed by central Scotland and Northern Ireland, 22%, followed by Devon and Somerset, 10%, followed by the West Midlands, 5%. Then we have Leinster Island, 3%, and Southern Wales, 2%, and finally 2% Denmark there as well. Now, just for a bit of context, I am a native Cumbrian, born and lived here on this coastal region roughly, and as far back as my family can remember collectively, you know, we've always been here as far back as we can remember. I do know as well that I have some Scottish ancestry from my mum's side, and I don't really know too much about my dad's side, but it doesn't really surprise me then how I'm clustering compared to these modern populations. It's pretty much what I would have expected, really. Okay, now moving over to My True Ancestry. This is my deep dive full breakdown according to them. So look, you can see the highest percentage here is mainland Celt, 23.7%, followed by 15.6% affinity with profiles associated with the Britons. And then obviously you can see there's some Anglo-Saxon here as well, 15.4%, followed by 11.5% Gael. And you can also see there's some Viking Danish here as well, 11.3%, followed by some Frankish affinity here as well, 11.2%. And then as the drop really low, you know, sub 5% and under, there's some smaller ones here as well. So we have Celtic Deboni, Unaticha, Norwegian Vikings, Swedish Vikings, Vandals, Balari, Longobards, Celtic Parisi, and Illyrians as well. But these ones, I mean, they're sub 1%, so they're really, really small affinities there.
Okay, so there you go, guys. Thank you very much for watching today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please consider liking and subscribing, as it really does help the channel. And this video today, including my Diodorus translation, it's taken from my upcoming book, which I'm working on, which features all of my personal translations of all of Diodorus's texts relating to the tin trade. So there's a pre-order link in the description below. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the next one. Old boy, out.